Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are continuing to look through the book of Psalms. And today we are going to be looking at Psalm chapter 108. So turn with me to Psalm chapter 108. And today we will definitely look at the fact that God is victorious and how that is good for those that follow him. And so we will dive into that today. But before we do, we go back to having historical subscripts. And this one is pretty simple, a song, a psalm of David. So again, this is might have been written by David, but just like a lot of the other psalms, this is a song. So this was meant to be sung, but I'm not going to sing it. But let's dive right in with verse 1. My heart is steadfast, O God. I will sing and make melody with all my being. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your steadfast love is great above the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the clouds. So you have a little bit of mention of harps and lyres of the song aspects in verse 2. And then you also have adoration of who God is. And then you also have thanks to the Lord for who he is in verse 3. Now we start to see a little bit more of where we're going with this. Verse 5. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth, that your beloved ones may be delivered. Give salvation by your right hand and answer me. So we have the psalmist, whether it be David or somebody else, that is wanting to hear from the Lord, and he reminds himself and those that are reading or singing along with the psalm that God is in control of everything. He is in control of the heavens. He is in control of the earth, as it says in verse 5. And he believes that God will deliver him, as we see in verse 6. So there is something going on with the psalmist, and he is asking for deliverance from the Lord. He's asking for help from the Lord. And now he is going to go into his triumphs, the Lord's triumphs as well. Verse 7. God is promised in his holiness. And again, holiness here, some have thought that this could mean sanctuary. So basically, the place where God dwells is the idea. I think the word holiness is a great word to use here. It's just reminding us of the concept of holiness, which is that the Lord is set apart. So, because he is set apart, it's because he not only promises, but fulfills his promises. Now, he does it according to his time and according to his will, and those may not always line up with our will and our timing, but whenever he promises something, he always fulfills that promise. So that is very, very important to remember as we are going on with this. So then, verse 8. Gilead is mine. Oh, sorry, go back to verse 7. With exultation I will divide up Shechem and portion out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I cast my shoe. Over Philistia I shout in triumph. All right, so there's a lot of names of locations here. So you have Shechem, you have the Valley of Succoth, you have Gilead, Manasseh, Ephraim, Judah, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. So what's interesting about this is how it is split up. So in verse 7, you have more locations. Not that the others aren't. We'll get into that in a second. But verse 7, you have more of locations. So the city of Shechem, you have the valley of Succoth. Whereas in verse 8, you are talking more about regions or areas that are very much connected to the tribes of Israel. You have Gilead, you have Manasseh, you have Ephraim, and you have Judah. So that is really interesting. And then finally, in verse 9, you have three places: Moab, Edom, and Philistia. They're all enemies of God's people in the Old Testament, in their own different ways and sections. They come against the people of Israel. And so I think that's a really interesting uh, an interesting breaking up of those three things. But now let's go into it. So, with the places in verse 7, you have God dividing up and portioning out. And so, what this is basically saying is that because God promised the promised land to his people and fulfilled that promise, now he is portioning out or dividing up these cities to the Israelite people, Shechem and the Valley of Succoth. So that is mentioned first. Then you have verse 8, which are directly connected to the Israelites, to the people of God in the Old Testament. And you have Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah my scepter. There is personal connection between God and these regions that are absolutely connected to the Israelite people. And so I think that is just really, really cool. But then you have verse 9, and that's where you see the triumphant language come into play. When we're talking about a wash basin, we're talking about, well, it's very simple right there, a wash basin, but making something clean, casting my shoe, shouting in triumph. The Lord is basically saying all the enemies of my people in the Old Testament, Moab, Edom, and Philistia, they are all have all been brought down by me. And that is true from what we see in the Old Testament. And so I think that is a beautifully written and a beautifully structured section of the psalm to show you and I that one, God keeps up with his promises, as we saw in the start of verse 7. But then we also see that God is victorious, especially in verse 9. But now we go a little bit further with that triumphant idea in verses 10 through 13, or the end of the chapter. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go out, O God, with our armies. O grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. With God we shall do valiantly. It is he who will tread down our enemies. All right, so what is going on here? The psalmist, whether it be David or someone else, is saying to the Lord, look, we are going out on our own strength with our armies, and it's not working. And so he's asking a genuine question. Has the Lord rejected them? Has the Lord left them, since he is not going out with their armies? And so the psalmist recognizes that on our own strength as followers of the Lord, we can do nothing. We have to have the Lord behind us. And that's where he gets to in verses 12 and 13, but specifically verse 12. Oh, grant us help against the foe, for vain is the salvation of man. And this is still such a very important lesson that you and I need to remember as followers of Jesus, that without Jesus, there is nothing that we can do. It doesn't mean that you and I, without Jesus, sits home and does nothing, even though Jesus does sustain us. And so, in a way, that's true too. But what's being talked about here, though, is the idea that there is nothing that we can do on our own strength that impacts that impacts our life even to a fraction of what the Lord does for us. There's no comparison. And with God we shall do valiantly. It is he who will tread down our enemies. Again, the mentioning of the personal connection to the Lord in verse 8. Because he has sought us out, and he has called us to be his children, for those that have accepted him. Then you have the Lord fulfilling his promise and providing for his people in verse 7. And then you have the Lord triumphantly defeating the foes in our life in verse 9. And yes, today it may not be armies per se, but our foes are anger. Our foes are hatred. Our foes are lying or stealing, lust, envy, whatever it might be. Those things that are sins, those things that break the heart of God, those are foes in our life. And we should absolutely call upon the God who treads down all foes. And so that is, I think, a little bit what we can learn from this wonderful psalm. So thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today as we traveled through another psalm, and we will continue to do so next week. But thanks for spending a little bit of time with me today in Psalm chapter 108. I will see you next week. Thanks.